Yeah, so I think sure there will be some more people trickling in here, but let me start by welcoming everyone to our last presentation, last seminar in our N-Optimal series, at least for this this season. Perhaps we'll come back in the fall. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. It's Professor Andrew Chien from the University of Chicago. Andrew has an accomplished career. I'll just mention a few highlights here. He's the William Eckerd Professor at U Chicago. He's the director of the Center for Unstoppable Computing. And he's also senior scientist at Argonne National Lab. That's how I met Andrew in the first place, since I also do part of my work at Argonne. Currently, he serves on the National Science Foundation CISE Advisory Committee. He leads the Zero Carbon Cloud project, which I think we will hear more about in his presentation. He served as Vice President of Research at the Intel Corporations from 2005 to 2010. He also had professor appointments at UCSD and University of Illinois in the past, and he is a fellow of ACM, IEEE, and AAAS. He did earn his PhD, his master's, his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD from MIT. So he's he knows MIT very well. And he also mentioned to me that he spent a little bit of time in Leeds during his years in Cambridge. Just a couple of practical issues. So if you want to ask questions, feel free to do that along the way. You can feel free to raise your hand virtually or to turn on your camera, and also we'll have some time for questions and answers in the end. With that, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Aidan, for that very kind invitation, and thanks to the organizers of the seminar for inviting me. As Auden just pointed out, I am what in the MIT world they call a lifer. So I spent all of my 3 degrees at MIT, but I did manage to escape after that, and have had quite a lot of fun in other places. So please, don't feel like you have to spend all of your life at MIT. So it's a very wonderful place. It's a special pleasure, as Auden pointed out, to come and talk at MIT, because I do have such a strong connection to the place. And also very happy to talk to this group because we're in a very exciting time for the transformation of the power grid. I think sometimes, folks who work on the power grid can be so close to it, they don't realize how rapid and dramatic these changes are. They're just in the fray. It really feels like we went through a period of the past 20 years of figuring out how to integrate small amounts of renewables. And we're now facing this major challenge in the next decade or two of how to balance a grid on renewables as the primary source of energy. And I think that's a fundamental and difficult challenge. In that vein, I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing to understand productive coupling of adaptive loads, which I think many of us believe are essential to achieving that dream of a power grid, powered predominantly by volatile renewable sources. So how to couple those adaptive loads with the power grid effectively. And the pictures I have up in the corner here are really this notional idea of zero carbon cloud that we had back in 2015, and it'll become clear what I mean by that. And the fact that there actually are startups doing this now. This is a facility that was built at a place called McAdoo in Texas by a commercial startup called Lancium, trying to actually build, what was just a Photoshop photo that we have here on the left for integrating computing resources with renewable generation plants. Okay. So here's what I'm going to try to get through today. First, I'm going to talk about this brand new grid with renewables, curtailment, and negative pricing as daily features all over the world. Then I'll talk about this idea of computing on stranded power, which was our first foray into trying to understand, could this curtailment and negative price power be made useful, right, for computing? And then I'll talk about really what is our most recent work here, which is a bunch of experiments looking at how we could couple these adaptive loads or data centers to a modern power grid, in particular at a scale that is realistic for the hyperscale cloud providers today. And we'll talk about both the potential benefits, what can be realized, and some of the coordination challenges. And I hope that tees up really just the beginning of what is a vigorous discussion. So I expect many of you are already well aware that the power grid has been disrupted over at least the last 2 decades, maybe more, by the introduction of large-scale distributed energy resources. In the US, this was characterized by the rise of ISOs, independent power markets, that were spun out and established by FERC a little over 20 years ago to integrate these decentralized energy resources. And these resources, can be very small, right? They can be an 8 kilowatt rooftop installation, or they can be extraordinarily large, right? And we're seeing more and more. Here's a picture of a gigawatt scale solar farm in Spain, and in Gansu in China, right? This wind farm, right, is intended to be built out to 8 gigawatts or something like that, and perhaps even beyond. And one of the side effects of this, right, this attempt to integrate these volatile energy resources is the rise of what we call stranded power. So again, I expect you guys all understand how the power grid and power markets work. Often I give these talks to computing people who often don't have much understanding, but in simple terms, right, the way we think about it is that the new way the dispatch is happening is that these volatile generators are offering power in whatever capacity, whatever quantity they can for particular time intervals. And the power grid and the power market is looking at the load and looking at the bid pricing and so on. And in effect, through these optimal power flow kinds of computations and market closing mechanisms, deciding who gets to put power into the grid. And sometimes the answer is no, you can't. That leads to curtailment. And then often, even more often than curtailment, there's the consequence, which is, yes, you can put that power into the grid, but you bid a negative price, or you're a price taker, and the price that you're going to get is going to be a negative price. That is, you have to pay for the privilege of putting that power into the grid. So we refer to both curtailed power and negative price power as stranded power, and we view that as an underutilized asset. And I'm just going to flip through this couple of slides really, really fast to talk about this work we've been doing to characterize this phenomena. Just to make clear what we mean by stranded power, here's one example of stranded power for a particular wind site in the MISO power grid. So they have detailed 5-minute dispatch data that you can get, and what this chart shows across the x-axis is the ecomax offered by this site. That is the potential maximum power that this site could generate for, say, the next 5-minute interval. And the y-axis shows the amount of power that was cleared from that site. And if you think about how this is plotted, what this means is that if the power that was offered was always cleared, all the dots would be on this diagonal line, right? Of course, you can see lots of the dots are below this diagonal line, and that represents curtailment, right? So there's a large quantity of curtailment at this particular site. This data is taken from 2015, January through April. Tends to be a little bit windy in the Midwest during that time. And the quantity of power at this site is pretty significant. Maybe not in the context of a grid, but it's certainly large compared to the kinds of computing systems we think about. So it's 100 megawatts plus, and there are other examples that are even larger, gigawatt scale. So that's one example of this curtailment or negative price power that's happening in the grid. In a wind renewable kind of grid, MISO has a lot of wind power. A second place we went and looked at this, and I spent a sabbatical at Cal ISO, and that's what was required to get access to some of this data, though everything I'm showing you now is public. Shows that wind and solar curtailments are increasing significantly in Cal ISO as they drive to higher and higher renewable fraction. And you can look at these graphs on the right. 2017 is the light blue, 2018 is the dark blue, then 2019 is the yellows, and then 2020 is sort of the maroon bars. And there's some fluctuation, right? It depends on how much runoff there is and hydro generation and so on. But generally, the secular trend is towards higher and higher curtailment. And in the study that I did when I was at Cal ISO, we were able to document a 40% compound annual growth rate in the curtailment, having to do with growing imbalance between this volatile renewable generation and the normal, load kinds of structures that are happening. And the quantity of power in 2019 was somewhere between 1.5 terawatt hours to maybe as much as 5, depending on how you characterize the negative price power. Of course, so this is a large quantity of power and is growing rapidly. California, of course, has extraordinarily ambitious goals for how far and fast they want to drive their renewable or carbon-free electricity. And it's actually interesting. What you'll find is that the power grids generally are trying to minimize this kind of publicity around how much curtailment and so on is happening. In fact, they were so sensitive about it, they insisted when I wrote this report that we not call it stranded power, because that might be construed as negative. They insisted that this report be entitled Characterizing Opportunity Power to try and sort of make a virtue out of it. But they are fast and furiously trying to figure out how to solve these problems in a fashion that is economical, but they're very much paddling upstream on this, right? It's not just in a couple of power grids, it's really everywhere. So we recently did an initial study. We haven't quite finished analyzing all the data for curtailment and ERCOT, curtailment and stranded power, where we were able to get pricing and curtailment data. And what you can see is, over the past, say 5 years or so, dramatic increase both in curtailment and in stranded power, that is negative price power. And it's pretty well known in the Texas power grid that a lot of this is caused by transmission constraints between the West and East that have periodically been alleviated, but continue to sort of come back, right, as more and more renewables are added to the grid. Here's a grid-wide analysis.
Sorry, just to understand,
sure.
Very interesting.
Please.
So your definition is that stranded power is produced at a negative price, you said, right?
That's right.
So you look at the locational marginal price at the location of the wind farm, and you calculate the amount of power produced during negative prices at that specific location, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's right. And the reason we think of it is we wanted to look at that is for two reasons. One is that if you actually wanted to site a facility and exploit that power, that would represent an economic opportunity, right? And of course, the value of zero price is sort of arbitrary, right? If you talk to economists about this, they'll tell you, yeah, zero is just another number, right? Mm-hmm. So whether it's 0 or 5 or something, it is not so important, but it's a particular well understood, point of reference. Mm-hmm. Really, we know that the production tax credits and other kinds of what the economists call externalities are causing generators to want to force this power into the grid. Mm-hmm. Right. And but it turns out they don't actually have to force it in the grid. They actually could sell it to somebody else, and that would fulfill their legal requirements for their PTCs, which is an interesting opportunity that a whole bunch of VCs are trying to exploit. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But nonetheless, this captures some notion of the growing imbalance, right, in the grid, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we actually, so those are single sites. ERCOT was the whole grid. This is a study we did a number of years ago now, looking at negative price, curtailed and negative price power in the MISO grid, looking at how much power there is grid-wide, right? The first time we did this, we were kind of astonished at how large these numbers get. Again, this is based on 5-minute intervals, but the numbers are as large as 8 gigawatts, right? And then, of course, they go down to quite low. But for very significant amounts of time, they're in the multi-gigawatt kind of range. So we published some of the first, temporal studies and spatial studies, right, of this stranded power. And it's kind of an interesting thing because most of the people who study grids view this as waste, right? And therefore they characterized it only in sort of gross aggregate, over the year, over the grid. Whereas because we were interested in trying to figure out how to use it, how to actually balance it, we tried to characterize it both with respect to time and quantity, as I'll talk about it a little bit later. Now, of course, this is not, a uniquely American phenomena, and it's been widely studied sort of all over the world, and seems to be a secular phenomena due to the rise of these renewable energies. I like to point out that, the biggest curtailer of power in the world is China, because it happens to be, the biggest wind generator in the world. But this is, happening pervasively in Europe, as well as China in the United States and other areas. And we were studying this, and the first thing we did when we learned about this was to try and figure out if this was a persistent, secular, and growing phenomena. And we've concluded that it is, right? And now I think much of the world has concluded that it is. And then a few years into our work, we came across this really nice paper that I believe Auden was actually one of the co-authors for this Blue Ribbon report that was published from the Department of Energy. And one of the many, many graphs in this Blue Ribbon report from late 2017 is this nice chart that shows that the capacity credit or capacity factor for renewables generally decreases as you add renewable generation to the power grid. And this was kind of a meta study looking at a bunch of real experience as renewable power was added, generation was added to these grids, and then some hypothetical studies, I believe, as well. But basically, the fact that these lines generally go down as they go to the right shows that the effectiveness of that generation is less and less as the renewable fraction grows. That effectively means there's more curtailment. That effectively means that not as much of their generated power is making it into the power grid. So this was, for us, so first, it's a terrific piece of work. So if you haven't seen this, I strongly encourage you to look at it. But the second thing is it was tremendously encouraging to us that we were on the track of something that was a real problem and a persistent problem that we had to face if we were going to solve some of these challenges in creating a power grid that depends heavily on renewables as the primary source of electricity. Okay, so that's sort of the first story that I wanted to address. So then, as computer scientists, we were very interested in this question of, could we actually use this stranded power to do useful computing? And the way that I explain the idea that we pursued, zero carbon cloud, computing on stranded power, is something like this. The picture I like to show is in the traditional world, we have a power grid, we have renewable generation, we have traditional generation, and the power grid sort of forms what the computer scientists think of as an abstraction. Right? It forms up all of those complicated, messy entities into the simple abstraction of reliable power. And then the data centers are connected to that, and they just pull their 10 megawatts, their 40 megawatts, maybe their 200 megawatts these days of reliable power, and they work on their cloud computing problems. So the idea we had for zero carbon cloud was to change the mix. That is to, of course, have traditional reliable data centers, but think about adding a set of unreliable data centers that use unreliable power by coupling to the other side of the power grid in some sense, next to the generation or at some attach point, but with the service level agreement that was unreliable intermittent generation. And then the question was, from a computing point of view, if I had these two kinds of resources, how much use could I make of these unreliable resources, right? So the idea is to shift load to exploit these zero carbon resources, because the notion is if they're only consuming curtailment or maybe some of the negative price power, in effect, the power they're consuming is truly zero carbon. It's marginally zero carbon. And you could effectively eliminate their scope 2 carbon impact. And then, it also turns out to have some positive benefits for the grid, which I'll get to in a minute. So that was the idea. So we set upon this as computer scientists with this goal of, how much could we make use of these kinds of resources to eliminate the carbon footprint of the cloud? So the first question we asked was, okay, you've got this quantity of stranded power. How long is it available? And this was kind of an interesting question because nobody knew the answer to this. So does it come and go every 5 minutes? Does it persist for 8 hours a day, right, as you might expect for solar or something like that? Or does it exist for much longer usable intervals? So we did a characterization of MISO sites, looking at ones that could deliver this kind of stranded power, and we looked at the intervals that could be created by just taking the power as it existed, subject to some acquisition constraints. And those acquisition constraints were net price zero, that is, over a run of an interval, the net price of that power was zero. Net price 1, net price 2, net price 3, net price 4, net price 5. In simple terms, each of those is a slightly higher threshold. So if the average price for power over an interval was less than $5 a megawatt hour, and this in a power grid that the long-term, 12-month average is about $20 to $25 a megawatt hour. So this is substantially below average market price. How long are the intervals you would get by just taking those segments, right? First time the price goes below your threshold, start taking power, and then keep taking power as long as your long-term average is below that number. So we call this the net price model. And it turns out, if you look at the good places, the good locations in the power grid, that there are many, many intervals that have extremely long duration, so longer than 100 hours. There are many that have durations 10 to 100 hours, the brown here. And then there are a smaller number that have duration 1 to 10 hours, and so on. But if you think about it, not from the perspective of counting intervals, which is, I didn't show you that data, but from the perspective of contribution to available time when you have power at that data center, so-called duty factor, what you can see is the predominant contribution to duty factor, of course, comes from the long intervals, right? Because this is the value weighted sum, right? So this, it turns out, suggests that you can actually make effective use. Not only can you get to 80% duty factor, but the majority of that duty factor is coming from intervals that are at least 10 hours and sometimes more than 100 hours, right? So, and this study we did based on analyzing the MISO data was later confirmed by this commercial company I mentioned earlier. So this commercial company that built a facility at McAdoo actually, was quoting in commercial contracts this bar on the right, which is an availability factor of 80%, guaranteed to be in the following distribution. These yellow intervals greater than 96 hours, these greater than 48 hours, these greater than 24 hours, and so on. And this was a conservative commercial bid, and their in-field empirical analysis was that they could actually hit 90%, right? And all of these other attributes, right? And you could reproduce this. This is just basically looking at the price and the time and the dispatch for particular nodes, right, in the ERCOT power grid, right? So
very interesting. Sorry, Andrew, to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Just to make sure I get this. So you're saying that so is the duty factor on the left and the availability on the right the same thing, basically?
More or less, yeah, more or less the same thing. Yeah.
So it means that roughly 80% of the time you have access to stranded power at this specific site. Is that?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, and it's actually more than 80% because they're willing to write a contract for 80%. Mm-hmm. So that means they've got some safety margin there, right?
Mm-hmm. And is this, when you look at prices, is that prices in the real-time market or the day-ahead market?
That's a good question. I think this is the real-time market. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Probably, yeah.
But they did this computation, so I don't have the full details of that. I can tell you for the MISO study, it was the real-time market.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So this was kind of interesting, and we said, oh my gosh, maybe there's an opportunity here, right? So there are these spatial and temporal opportunities in the structure of this waste, right, or stranded power that might make it usable. So we set off and did a study of something that I know a lot about, high performance computing, and asked the question, could we actually build an efficient HPC computing system based on this? So we took 1 year's workload from the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility, which is one of the premier supercomputing facilities in the world. And we had the model that we had, let's have one reliable supercomputer and let's have a second unreliable supercomputer powered by this zero carbon cloud kind of an idea. And then let's look at a couple of things. Let's look at how much, what performance looks like to users, that is turnaround time. I submit a batch job and how long does it take to turn around? And then the second, this question of total cost of ownership. Can you make this thing economic? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these research results. I refer you to the papers. But basically, the hybrid system that had one reliable system and one zero carbon cloud system essentially has user turnaround statistics that are statistically indistinguishable from the reliable system alone. That is, the variance properties and so on, the first and second and third modes are actually quite similar. And this suggests that you can integrate these kinds of intermittent resources with effectively no loss of quality of service. The second thing that we found, and this really depends on a pretty complicated total cost of ownership analysis, but we found that the total cost of ownership for these kinds of resources can be competitive in many regions today, and I'll show a chart for that in just a minute. And then most important for the supercomputing folks, we were able to show in this paper that was published in 2018 that as power requirements for these supercomputers grows, and as the dynamics, right, of their use evolve, that if you do the TCO analysis, you can actually build systems that have what the supercomputer people care about, which is higher peak performance per $1 million of TCO per year, 80%, as much as 80% higher by 2027, and throughput that is as much as 45% higher, right? And this is by trading OpEx for CapEx to allow you to build a larger and larger facility. To drill down a little bit on this, and again, I refer you to the studies that are complete, that are able to go at this more completely. But to give you an example of how this plays out, what we did is, these are 3 different well understood and well documented TCO models. HAM3 and HAM5 come from James Hamilton, who was well-known cloud expert at Amazon and Microsoft, and back at Amazon again. And then the Burrell set model is a well-known academic kind of TCO model. And what you can see here is that you can either have a resource model that is pure reliable, that's the red, or you can have the one that is light green, which is a reliable resource paired with an NP0 resource that achieves 60% duty factor. Or you can have a reliable resource paired with an NP5, right, slightly higher power price, that achieves 79% duty factor by being willing to pay for a little bit more power. Basically this compares throughput per $1 million of TCO. And what you can see is, depending on the model, right, it's possible for the combined system to be more cost effective, right? But how much more cost effective it is depends a little bit on what your baseline is for power prices, right? So in the US, if you assume a $60 retail per megawatt hour price versus in Japan, maybe it's 240. In Germany, it's significantly higher, maybe as much as 5 times higher. That affects the trade-off, but in all of these, it's possible for the green powered, zero carbon cloud, at least half system, to be more cost effective, right? And the reason this is possible is, of course, that we're assuming the power costs are reduced, right, dramatically by acquiring this low cost power in conjunction with helping the power grid. The second thing we're assuming is that there's a lower physical infrastructure cost. So the lower physical infrastructure cost is coming from this idea that in order to achieve this 60% duty factor or the 79% duty factor, you can actually chip away at all of this cost of super high reliability in the data center that have become, sort of the central driving factor of design for many cloud and commercial data centers. They're typically targeting 5 nines, but there's no point in engineering for 5 nines when your fundamental power source is only 1 9. Let's say, call it 1 9, 90% duty factor. So you can give up all kinds of things, right? And that allows you to reduce the physical infrastructure costs. And that, of course, is all traded against this reduction in duty factor, which is you can only utilize the resource, say 60 or 80 or 90% of the time. So net on net, this resource can be cost effective, and it's more so with higher power costs. Now, we talked about this in simplistic terms. We have one whole data center that's reliable and one data center that's not reliable. When we talk to cloud people, we tell them that you can do this in a virtual way. There's no reason you have to have a physical building like that, but you can think about having a virtual data center and having slices for which a base is, powered by reliable power, and you have headroom, right, which is powered by this stranded power. And by modulating that headroom, you can actually emulate, right, the effect, right, of having a zero carbon cloud complementary resource. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because that drives an agenda for how one should redesign data centers in the future.
Just a quick question on the
Sure.
bar graphs there. When you compare the red and green bars, so you have higher throughput, but what about the ability to complete jobs on time, or does it take longer time to complete jobs with a?
Yeah, that's the service. That's the service thing. So we looked at user turnaround, right? So from a user point of view, if I submit to a queue that's just a reliable machine, or I submit to a queue that's a reliable machine paired with one of these zero carbon cloud machines, the question is, can you tell the difference statistically for what your turnaround time looks like? And the answer is basically no, you can't tell.
Okay.
We can go a lot into sort of how all this comes together. Now, but that is the result. The only caveat I would give is that we didn't consider running jobs across both resources at the same time. So the maximum job size is one that fits either in the reliable resource or in the zero carbon cloud thing, right? So that's the one, I would say minor weakness of the result. But one thing that's important to realize is that these supercomputing folks, in general, have a hard time keeping their systems up for a very, very long period of time. And they also, because they're shared resources, are trying to keep job times down to some reasonable limit. So the maximum run times for these job queues are typically 24 hours, right? They typically don't allow a single job to run for a week or something like that. So that makes it easier to do this scheduling, right? Okay, so I should,
a
go ahead.
quick question. You said that from the perspective of the end user, statistically, there is no difference whether his job is submitted to a controllable data center or a low reliability one.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
I'm just wondering, is there any? Does it make sense to have some new pricing models to incentivize people to submit more jobs?
I think, so just to be technically
how you can
precise,
elicit also this information from the user. I mean, how much they are willing to pay.
It's a good question. So just to be technically precise, we compared submitting to a queue which is just the reliable one versus submitting to a queue which is both, right? We didn't compare, this one versus that one, right? Just to be clear, right? But we did propose an idea, which we never actually published, which is, you could just ask job submitters, do you mind, right? Would you be willing to wait a little bit longer? Are you not under a paper deadline, right? To make your computation greener. And we suspect many scientists would often check that box. Now, the economic side of it, right? In terms of, would people, be willing to wait for lower price? I think there are some interesting examples of that in the cloud already, Spot Fleet and other kinds of things. And that's a whole different discussion. We've done a bunch of work in that space as well, and would be happy to talk about that. But that's I think a super interesting thing. And that actually ties to something that I was just going to get to next, which is this Lancium company, right, that I mentioned that built this facility, actually has a service that they call pausable computing. So they did this with that hardcore heavyweight CS technology, which is they actually pause VMs, right? And basically they have a value stack. And, as the power goes down, they pause the lowest value ones. Lowest value to them means lowest price, right, to the customers, right? And they have a pretty complicated prioritization system and so on. So it's a super interesting endeavor that these guys are pursuing. And if you're interested in that direction, Stefanos, I recommend you go talk to them. They're super interesting. But I consult, in the interest of full disclosure, I consult a little bit for them because they showed up on my doorstep about 3 years ago saying they wanted to do this, and they had separately invented a bunch of the ideas, and they found our zero carbon cloud stuff, and they said, this is exactly what we want to do. So I serve as a consultant for them, and they're extremely, innovative company, right? And they understand quite a lot about power grids. But they're offering several different services. One is you can put new equipment there. The second is you can take your old equipment there, because your old equipment may be fully depreciated and it may be less energy efficient, but that's the kind of equipment you should put into one of these low-cost power places. And they even have a service where you can put your old equipment and not pay them anything, and they give you half of the cycles back, more or less, and they take the other half for doing other computation, right? Okay, so that was, I should push on here because, I want to get through to some of the rest of this stuff, right? So let me push on here. So then, that was the computing side of it. And we're pretty excited about the opportunities there. And we talked to cloud companies. And as I said, I'm consulting with several organizations to try and help make that happen. But then we got excited about this question of, After my time at Cal ISO, I got really worried about the future of the renewable grid, and they're looking for every solution they can find. So we started thinking about this question of, can adaptive loads help the grid? And the idea we first looked at was, can you take this zero carbon cloud and use it and think of it as a dispatchable load or an adaptive load for the power grid, and what impact does that have? So with colleagues Victor Zavala and Quebec Kim at Argonne, we did a study of CAISO and WEC, and I imagine you guys know about the characteristics of this system. And we looked at this question of what would happen in the future as we add more and more renewables to this grid. What happens to the grid and its ability to absorb renewable generation as you increase the wind penetration level? So at the time we did the study, it was about 15%. And then we scaled it out to 50%. And what you can see is, unsurprisingly, that the wind, which is basically from the top of this maroon bar down to the bottom of this, lightish green bar, as you add wind, it progressively displaces thermal generation, right? That's exactly what you'd expect. But a good portion of the renewables that are being added are being lost. They're being spilled or curtailed or whatever you want to call it. And if you look at the economic situation, it's even worse, right? So of the wind that is being absorbed, this is the wind that's being absorbed at LMP greater than 0. And this is the wind that's being absorbed at LMP less than 0. So in effect, what our study showed is that the economic prospects for such increased wind was really exceedingly poor. It looked like you could force a lot more wind into the grid, but it was all going to be at negative prices. And then, of course, there's a growing amount of spillage that never makes it into the grid, right? So that was kind of a discouraging, kind of result. And then, if you looked at where CAISO at that time was trying to get to by 2020, now we're past 2020, their RPS goal was 33%, and their 2030 RPS goal is now 60%, and their 2045 goal is 100%. Now, of course, it's a different mix of renewables and a bunch of other things, and so on. But this was our baseline, and we said, okay, so clearly the grid has challenges in absorbing all of this renewable that we're hoping to add to it. So what happens if we add data centers to that as an adaptive load? So this represents, again, thinking from the computing side, 4 different ways of integrating data centers into the power grid. The first is just a reference base case with no data centers added. The second is a case where we just straight up add 20 200 megawatt data centers at particular places picked to be the places where there's lots of excess generation in the grid. And then the third case was we build data centers, but we add a matching average annual capacity of renewable generation on site. And then the fourth case was we have these dispatchable zero carbon cloud data centers, right? And the clear winner is these dispatchable adaptive loads. And again, if you understand grid dynamics, you might not be too surprised by this, but we have multi-billion-dollar corporations doing things like 2 and 3 for sure, right? But definitely they're doing 3. And the problem here is that because of the dynamics around that renewable generation and these data centers, that if they could be adaptive, you could dramatically reduce dispatch costs. The second thing that's true is that if you look at the achieved RPS for these grids, in fact, the choice of how you integrate these resources makes a huge difference. And it made, in our studies, up to a 7% difference in the RPS, an annual about 18 terawatt hours of absorbed renewable energy. The fact that it was dispatchable versus this other kind of model. Now, of course, the problem is that the data centers don't want to be dispatchable, and they want to achieve a high number of 9s for their reliability. So, subsequent to this study, we actually decided to study slightly richer models for adaptive load. See, how am I doing on time here? Okay. So, if you look at what's happening out there with these hyperscale clouds, Facebook, for example, does load distribution over multiple sites, not to absorb renewable energy, but to fill their data centers. Academics over a long period of time, more than 15 years, have been writing papers on load shifting, but they generally all ignore grid impacts of their actions. They're all trace-driven, decoupled kinds of studies. And Google has recently been talking about doing time and space shifting in its own independent autonomous fashion, separate from the grid. So with all this as backdrop, we recently completed a study looking at realistic data center shifting, which I'm going to talk about the results from. So this paper is going to appear in E-Energy just next month, and it's work done by a very bright student named Peter Lin, who works with me. So this paper the study actually looks at 3 different models for coupling data centers in the power grid. So here's 3 different models. At the left, we have the traditional model, and in a traditional model, we have data centers as fixed loads, and they basically just tell the power grid, here's the power I'm going to consume, right? So that's the traditional model and has one optimization domain, OPF, over the power grid. The second model we'll call Locus local selfish, and the particular scheme we implemented was price optimization. And here you have individual data centers acting. So you have OPF going on in the grid, and you have individual data centers acting with their local optimization based on their local visibility of prices and some reasonable prediction of the future. And then you have an iterative kind of coupled optimization going on between these 2 solvers. And then the third approach that we considered was grid control. That is, the data centers give control over their flexibility to the power grid, and the power grid sets, using OPF, right, the best dispatch to minimize, of course, dispatch cost in the power grid and controlling these adaptive loads, right? And you can think of the previous study that I just described as an on-off example, right, of this kind of model where the grid is deciding whether the data centers are consuming power and at what level. We looked at a bunch of different configurations. So we have a baseline WEC model that forms the comparative point. We considered a future with more data centers, and we considered adding 10 to 40 data centers, 200 megawatts each at 70% average load, because you can't fill a data center completely. This corresponds to 3.5 to 14% of the grid load. This is actually kind of interesting, because when we did the previous study, we were worried that 200 megawatt data centers looked kind of big, because people were talking about 40 megawatt data centers. But it turns out that we undershot, and these data centers are not only 200 megawatts, they're actually growing very, very fast. And most of the large hyperscale cloud folks are designing gigawatt facilities now to be online in the next few years. In terms of percentage of grid load, right, the scenarios we study are 3.5 to 14% of grid load. And I think that this corresponds to realistic for today already, some of the higher penetration, data center penetration grid loads. Northern Virginia is at 6 to 7% today in 2020, and on track to double in a 5-year period. It could be even at 14% by as early as 2025. Now, nationally, right, in the US, data centers are maybe a little bit north of 2%. So these are the leading edge cases, but they're not unrealistic cases at all, right? And then the future of more renewables, maybe 15 to 60% wind penetration. And then we consider different levels of load flexibility, 0 to 20% to 40% to 60%. So for 60%, the data center would go from 0.4 to 1.0 load. So that would be 80 megawatts to 200 megawatts. And then we considered the 3 different coupling methods. And then, of course, we looked at the impact on the grid, data centers, and other loads. Let's see. So just to calibrate people, if you look at dispatch costs and you look at generation mix, as you add renewables here, so 15, 30, 45, 60 on both sides here, and then increase the number of data centers, 10, 20, 30, 40. There's a whole bunch of separate scenarios in the paper, but this is the combined one that sort of shows the result. You get sort of a similar picture to what I showed you for the study we did with zero carbon cloud. As the amount of renewables increases and you have a curtailment penalty, right? The dispatch cost rises actually with the curtailment penalty for not accepting that wind. And then if you look at the generation mix, what you see is more and more wind is being absorbed, but curtailment is also growing, again, in a fashion very similar to what we saw with the previous zero carbon cloud study. So, the bottom line here is absorption grows, but with the decreasing renewables capacity factor, just like that DRE Blue Ribbon study showed. But a couple of interesting things. it turns out that adding data centers decreases grid RPS, right? And this is something the computing community doesn't understand, that just by virtue of adding these data centers, that they're actually making it harder and harder for the grid to achieve its RPS goals. So here's 0 data centers, here's 40 data centers out at the 60% wind penetration state. And when you go from 0 to 40, your RPS goes down, right? So when we first saw this, we were kind of mystified, saying, what the heck, why is this true? And by the way, the gap is even larger over here at lower wind penetration. But it turns out that the reason this is true is it's sort of obvious after the fact. What's going on is the data centers are being introduced as constant loads. And of course, the renewable generation is up and then down, right? This is the whole basis of the Google 24/7, kind of escapade that they're on right now. And what's happening is that because the load is misaligned with the renewable generation, you just keep consuming power independent of whether there's renewables, then you wind up driving the RPS down, because if you have an average duty factor for renewables of 30 or 35%, then you're 2/3 on the no renewables and the 1/3 on the renewable side. So that turns out to be the intuition. So data centers by themselves are not good for grid RPS. Now, if you add adaptation, right, then there's opportunity maybe to improve the situation. So again, DP online is the local selfish optimization, and GC is the global grid optimization. Here's a couple different scenarios, different wind penetration, and different dynamic ranges. So we start from a lower dynamic range and we increase the dynamic range as you move to the right. And what you can see is that as you increase wind penetration, as you increase the dynamic range, you can get larger benefits to dispatch cost and this adaptive control or adaptive load. And the local optimization can improve our dispatch costs, but this centralized optimization, or what we call grid control, actually improves the dispatch cost by a larger fraction. And these improvements can be pretty significant. This is like a 3% overall improvement in dispatch costs. So that's pretty significant in a power grid wide thing. So that's one interesting observation. This is how much it can help. The second thing we looked at was effect on grid RPS. So as we add renewables and as we add the ability to have large dynamic range, which you can see is, again, these bars get larger and larger. So the answer is that yes, we can improve grid RPS with adaptation. Both forms of adaptation allow us to improve grid RPS. Now, the benefit for local optimization is these green bars, and the benefit for the grid control optimization is these purple bars. So the benefit for the grid control optimization, of course, is more. And this tallest bar here corresponds to removing the negative impact of the data centers on grid RPS. That is, we just about made up for the problems that we were causing by introducing this load. So we've neutralized the effect of the data centers with respect to grid RPS. I don't have time to show the graphs here, but data center RPS, if you just look at the RPS for the data centers, also improves, and the data center power cost also improves by using these dynamic schemes. But the downside of it is that the non-data center loads actually suffer differentially. They either don't get as much benefit, or they may even see an increase in their prices or effective RPS. And to give you some intuition for what's happening, this is sort of a drill down we did to make sure we understood what was going on. This is a study that attempts to capture the effect on conventional generation of adaptive load choices in our adaptive control techniques. So this is assuming we're doing, again, this local optimization. And if we're doing a local optimization and we have a scenario which is not adaptive and a scenario that's adaptive, what we would hope is when the adaptive control increases load, that's moving to the right here, that there would be no net increase in conventional generation, right? Because you're hoping you're increasing load at a time when there's excess renewables. So you should hope to be on this flat red line. But in fact, you can see the data points are not so good. And then likewise, when I'm decreasing generation due to the load due to this adaptation, you'd hope you were on this nice negative line. And as you can see, sometimes we get on this negative line, but sometimes we don't quite make it. So this is, something we're actively working on now, trying to understand how we can do better, coordination of local optimization to actually achieve carbon emission reductions. The second thing that I would point out is that this grid control scheme, which give very nice grid effects, is actually pretty bad for the data centers. So the grid control scheme damages data center effectiveness. So this plot shows over a 24-hour day for several of the different data centers in the fleet, right? We had 10 to 40. What is the capacity level that was set for the data centers? Now remember, they're going from 40% to 100%. So they're going from 80 megawatts up to 200 megawatts. And what you can see is this looks like a disaster, right? This looks like, basically you're turning me up and down all the time, almost every hour. So the impact on the data centers can be pretty negative. If you look at the average capacity change per hour that GC inflicts on these data centers, you can see that comparatively the local optimization and the grid control optimization are quite different. The grid control optimization is 2 to 3 times larger average change per hour. And in absolute terms, it's about 30% of the total capacity per hour. So the fact that these systems are highly stiff or highly ill-conditioned, or however you want to frame it, right, has very, very negative effects for the data centers. And if we tie it to our scheduling work, we've been able to show that this can reduce data center effectiveness by 30 to 60%. So this is a massive loss of capability. So that approach alone is certainly not going to fly. I don't have time to talk about quite all the other results, and I want to wrap up so I can have some questions. So let me just summarize here, and then we can talk about either questions or some provocative thoughts about interfaces. So I'd like to summarize by saying stranded power is a huge and growing problem, and that balancing is a major challenge for the future power grid. And we don't have any extant obvious solutions for that. We have a lot of hopes and dreams. Zero carbon cloud, we were able to show that for some computing loads, not all, the economics and service quality for computing as a dispatchable load are already viable. And we think with innovation, there'll be more and more opportunity there. One thing that I think is a message to the community is that data centers are no longer negligible in the power grid. They are driving the construction, the expansion of the power grid in many parts of the world. They're already large enough to shift grid dispatch in a significant way. And that means that if we're going to do good scientific studies of computing, trying to minimize or reduce its carbon impact, we have to study shifting in concert with grid simulation. And this isn't just a statement about computing. This, of course, applies to all large adaptive loads, right? And that just makes our modeling challenges a little bit more complicated. If you look at data centers as adaptive loads, it's easy to see that they can improve grid metrics, dispatch cost, RPS, and so on. But the problem is that there's a competing sphere of optimization, as I mentioned in my abstract, where their dynamic behavior can damage grid optimization, and likewise, the grid optimization can damage their local effectiveness, right, in the data center. So we need some kind of new cooperative interfaces in order to solve these problems. So how am I doing on time here, Stefanos or Auden, whoever's keeping my time here?
Yeah, we have 5-10 minutes left. So
okay, so let me just. There's been a lot of work in this space, but the distinguishing characteristic, I think, of our work is that we've been trying to couple at large scale power, right, the notion of data center and scheduling with the grid management. There's been a lot of study that looked at it with small scale power, like a lot of the demand response work looks at small quantities of power and they don't worry so much about the grid dynamics. And then a lot of the local management for data centers, again, assumes this decoupled model. There's been a rise of some really interesting work for novel coupling models, some by my colleagues. This is by colleagues at Wisconsin. And we've been trying to promote in the scheduling community this scheduling problem of variable capacity for folks who are interested in that side of it. And we published a paper just this spring in JSSPP, which is this job scheduling workshop of some significance that talks about a formal characterization of this variable capacity resource problem, and actually includes some traces derived from power grids and the like as a way of trying to stimulate research right in that space. So if you're interested in that space, I hope that you would take some of that stuff up. Let me just put this slide up and then we can maybe have some discussions. One of the challenges we're interested in is what are appropriate adaptive load interfaces? Because we seem to not have, this is so different, right, from where we were 10 or 20 years ago in the power grid, but we seem to not have, good models for how to do this. And it seems like these interfaces need to enable and respect two different or several different independent optimization domains, where customers for the grid are trying to optimize their business and their processes and so on. And the power grid needs to do its internal optimization. We don't seem to have the right sort of temporal, spatial, or other kinds of structures to do this. And then another question that I've become interested in is, if we have mechanisms to do this, how are they going to affect grid participation? Because one of the things that happened in computing, for example, is that when we went from mainframes to microprocessors, there was this radical devolution of computing from centralized to distributed. And it seems like the cost economics of distributed energy resources and microgrids and other kinds of things that are happening, in addition to the political aspects of that, community aspects of that, are making it more and more economic for organizations to either partially or completely, leave the grid, right? And that, of course, affects the remaining grid dynamics, right? Because once those loads are gone, then the pool of dynamic interaction changes. So we have to be careful about how we craft these interfaces and how that affects who participates. One could even imagine an apocalyptic scenario where the notion of a power grid kind of collapses, right? Just like insurance pools can collapse, right? So there you go. There's one provocative question.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Lots of interesting questions, and also thank you so much for the very interesting insights into one part of the grid that many of us, myself included, haven't really paid much attention to. So it's really, really interesting. So let's open up for some questions now. I see Le here. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for an exciting talk. We haven't met before. My name is Le Chien. I'm a professor at Texas A&M for the past 12 years. I also had the pleasure visiting Leeds over the past couple of years. And as you very well pointed out, this whole idea of load shifting around data centers has been going on a lot. But I was really excited to see the work that you're presenting here. Really thinking about a truly kind of a disruptive new architecture to differentiate different kinds of quality of services at the data center end. So that was very exciting. I have one comment and perhaps a question.
Mm-hmm. Please.
So, what you're envisioning, I think, will have a lot of ramifications on how the grid management and market management is going to be done, especially in the context that you're going to be coupling, what you call unreliable data centers with the unreliable power supplies in the format of some kind of a bilateral contracts. And then those bilateral contracts will have to be landed on top of today's ISO's market management software, which traditionally would have, treated the wind power, solar power, either as must take or treated the loads as must serve. So there will be I think there are a lot of interesting opportunity and challenges out there on rethinking about how do you kind of aggregate this sort of a interruptible balance contracts while dealing with the grid level security management and market management. And related to that, perhaps the question,
I'm sorry, why do you want to aggregate them?
Because you have to make sure, because as you said, these are large scale that you're envisioning. They are not distributed off the grid kind of arrangement. Therefore, even if I am building a data center that is exactly following the wind fluctuation, let's say in the context of Texas, from East Texas with West Texas, that power will still have to be wheeling over the grid on top of all the other arrangement that it already made out there. So it is the collective behavior of all of these that the system operator will have to worry about,
Yes.
Voltage securities, contingencies, and reliability margins and things like that.
That's right. But in the distributed spatial fashion of its structure, right? I agree. So in that sense, I understand what you mean by aggregation.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting formulation and problem modeling and optimization that needs to be done to actually really talk about that. So related to that point, one of your motivating example was about the compounded growth of curtailment energy across the world.
Yeah.
We also kind of looked into that about 12 years ago with Vestas in the context of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we found as you try to kind of to the best you can connect cause and effect on what is causing the curtailment. It's sort of a roughly breakdown into sort of 3 pieces. One is just the sheer lack of good forecast. Then the second is actually related with sort of a network congestions. And then the third is perhaps the way how the market is set up, roughly speaking. So one of the biggest causes of such curtailment might be coming from the network congestion aspect, right? So in other words, there might be, just transmission capacity being congested due to the overproduction of wind energy at the time. So I'm thinking in those kinds of situations where curtailment is caused by congestion, especially local congestion, how would this vision be able to solve some of those issues?
Yeah, I think potentially. I mean, so the phenomena of stranded power is kind of an interesting one. I think one can understand it very simply, actually. And let's see if I have that graph here. I don't think I have that. Oh, maybe I have that graph here. The way I try to explain it, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to come off as talking down, but I think there's a very sophisticated way to understand it, and then there's just sort of a crude way to understand it. This is the crude way to understand it, right? If we have 33% duty factor, in order to get to 100% renewables, we have to have max generation of 3 times that, right? That's just simple arithmetic. If I have max generation of 3 times that, then the fluctuations are now gigantic, right? Right. So there's just a pure straight up balancing problem, even without transmission constraints, right? Just ignore transmission constraints. Just the statistical variation, right, means that in fact, we're going to have excess lots of times, right? Now, if you drill down one more level and you say, of course, this manifests itself as not only this imbalance between generation and load, just purely statistical, right? Then on top of that, we have transmission constraints. That makes it even worse, right? And that compartmentalizes this overgeneration in these different parts of the grid. So I think that it's possible to think about disaggregation of load or placement of load or other kinds of optimization as a solution for that. The other solution that people propose, and that was in the New York Times this morning, is building tons more transmission, right? But my honest reaction to that is that that's a solution in the small, not a solution in the large. That is, we must build more transmission. There's no question about that, right? But if you look at just this macro balancing problem, it becomes immediately clear that you can't build enough transmission. It's impossible, right? It's not economically sensible to build enough transmission because at one end you have rare events, right? And then less and less rare kind of correlation of this generation, right? And it's not worth capturing, right, all of that power. You can't put up a transmission line that only gets used 2% of the year, right? Right. So at some point you're not going to have enough transmission, right? So I think we are moving into a world in which we need the ability to do much more complex optimization over a much more complex set of distributed adaptive loads and generators, which I think is where you were going, Lee, right?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we'll follow up offline. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would be happy to talk further. Yeah.
Great, very interesting. So we have one more question from Mika.
Please.
I believe.
I think you're muted.
Thank you so much. Hi, so thank you for the talk. My name is Micah Ziegler. I'm a postdoc with Jessica Transick, and I study systems with high percentages of variable renewable energy resources. And so I'm interested in as to whether when you were modeling, the data center loads, did you investigate where those loads were going? Because I remember maybe 15 years ago, they were discussing how data centers were going to have a massive impact on the grid. There was going to be a huge amount of increased grid load. And then
Yes.
I think around 2016, LBNL came out with a report that said, actually, it's kind of leveled out. It's gotten a lot better. There's been a lot of efficiency improvements. And actually, it's kind of stayed at a 4% growth rate pretty steadily in the in the early half of the 2010s. And some of this came from questions about what was going to happen to HVAC requirements and also the processing requirements. Did you look into some of that?
Yeah, we've been tracking that. That's obviously an important dimension of this. And I think there's a lot of disinformation in this space. So one has to be careful about reading this stuff. With no disrespect intended, the people at LBNL are very good. They're energy efficiency people. So they have sort of a vested stake in this the conclusion that you just cited, which is energy efficiency techniques solved a large part of this problem. And in particular, there was an article that was published in Science in last year that in fact talked about the fact that this load increase for data centers had leveled off at about 4% a year, like you mentioned. However, what was in the data in that report, but completely ignored in both the headline for that, as well as in the quotes by hyperscale cloud leaders that were around all of these news releases, was in fact that the hyperscale cloud folks are actually growing at exponential rates. They're growing at these dramatic rates. So this is Google's renewable energy portfolio numbers, all public numbers. You can get these from their sustainability reports. And basically, they've grown 13x in the past 7 years, right? So this is, because they buy offsetting renewable energy, basically it's a public disclosure for how much energy they're consuming, right? So, and then if you look at inside of the LBNL reports, you can see that the hyperscale cloud folks have actually been growing about a 30% CAGR for 2015 to 2018. And that's sort of where the data ends, right? Now, a lot of people think, and then we extrapolated that based on their renewable public information. So we believe it continued right through this period. And of course, if it continues at 30% CAGR, it soon becomes much the dominant portion of that total data center load. So, it's hard for any of us to say whether a 30% CAGR will be sustained for 5 years out in the future, right? It's but it's pretty clear that the consolidation of traditional data centers into hyperscale cloud, which is the reason, that people argue, the energy efficiency people argue that we're doing such a good job and overall data center load may not be increasing so fast. That consolidation is going to have to end in some way relatively soon, because it's such a large portion now. So either it ends with, the hyperscale cloud folks consolidate all of that load and then that's it, their growth rate slows down, or they finish consolidating and then this thing emerges, right, from this shadow, right, of the traditional data center load, and now we're stuck with the 30% CAGR, right? Now, the thing that's not realized in this, and why I think this projection may be even conservative, is the accelerated virtualization, right, due to COVID, right, has been, a driver for cloud growth. And then, of course, there's a lot of concern about the rise of machine learning as a driver for data, compute consumption growth and data center growth. So, so I think, to answer your question, I think that there's reasons to be concerned about the continued rapid growth of these data centers. And if you look inside of these hyperscale cloud companies, they have expansion plans that go out 10 years. I mean, they are buying land, they are securing, physical infrastructure for power distribution and all of these kinds of things, right? In all over Europe, right? In the United States, in the developing world, partly because they have a lot of cash, but partly because they believe some of these projections, right? So good question, though. Terrific question. Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. So we're looking at this stuff hard, and if you have data that points in the same direction or in other directions, we're super happy to see it. we talked to the folks at Google, we talked to the folks at Facebook and Microsoft and others, and we talked to the folks at Intel who are selling a lot of the CPUs that go into this and have a different angle on estimating growth. You know, I put these kinds of charts in front of them, and none of them say, nope, that's wrong, we're way slower than that. They all say, that looks kind of right. They don't want to publicly, you know, confirm. Yeah.
You know, to clarify, I don't have any data one way or another. I just remember, you know, years ago they said it was going to explode, and then LBNL came out with that report, and I was curious as to what your take was. So I appreciate the response.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting is 5G is also a huge driver. I mean, of course, 5G drives computing, but 5G itself, right? Both high-speed wide area networks and 5G base stations, right, are huge drivers of power consumption, right? And we should be, you know, a little bit worried about that, right?
Great. Okay, so we are well over time here. It was a very interesting discussion. So I don't see anyone, or do we have Guanan? Did you want to ask a question?
Yes. Thank you, Alan, and thank you for the very inspiring talk. So I'm Guanan He. I'm a postdoc at MIT Energy Initiative. So my research is mostly focused on battery storage and hydrogen storage modeling.
So cool stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is, what do you think of the option of having distributed renewable resources to couple with such super clouding station, like to have an own offline, off-grid option, maybe also coupled with battery storage and fuel cells or hydrogen, other energy carriers to make the data center 24/7 zero emission. Because I saw that Google and Facebook, they both have some plans that have 24/7.
Yeah, what they call 24/7 is a weird middle ground between offsetting and being fully off grid, right? So what they call 24/7 is that they sign some PTCs with some long-term contract purchase PPAs with some generation sources, and then they're basically clocking the amount of time overlap trying to get to 24/7, right? It's not quite being off grid, right? Because they depend on transmission, they depend on markets, they depend on all of those other kinds of things. Right now, what I hear from the data center folks is they don't want to bite the bullet and you know, pay the cost of going wholly off grid. And it's purely kind of a business way of thinking, right? So as long as they can derive some reliability benefit and some economic benefit and some operational complexity benefit from riding on the grid, at least in part, right? Then I think that they'll continue to do that. I think you're going to see in the near future some partial moving off the grid of those. That may be partially in time or partially in load. And I'm sure you understand the way that the tariffs work for lots of grids these days. You know, peak shaving, for example, is already worthwhile, right? For lots of loads. But I think that arbitrage around, you know, who participates in the grid and on what terms and what structure, you know, that I alluded to earlier, I think is an open, interesting question. I've been talking to some venture capitalists who are funding various kinds of intermittent load projects, some of which have nothing to do with computing, right? So one of the most interesting was a project around hydrolyzers and building biofuels, right? So you know, since you think about hydrogen, right? So these folks are doing, you know, excess renewable power driven hydrogen fuel manufacture, coupled with hydrolyzers for biofuel manufacturing based on bio waste from cities, right? With the ambition of creating biofuels that are carbon free for airplanes, right? So those kinds of loads I think are coming and can be adaptive loads, and they have sort of the right lightweight intermittent properties. But you know, it's all economics and market at that point, right? Yeah. It's things that I would leave to the economists and business people. But I think that area is great. I just wanted to put this slide up as a last thing, because I think, you know, one of the challenges in this kind of research space is the world is changing so fast. You know, the old paradigms may not be the right paradigms for 10 or 20 years out. So one thing that just stunned me when I read it was there's a bunch of folks who did a study under the DOE funding called the Solar Potential Pathways report for Minnesota. And they're looking at how do they get to 70% RPS. And this is the generation cost of, wind and PV and storage, right? Based on some economic models for, I can't remember exactly, 10 or 20 years out. And what they were arguing is that the lowest average cost comes with a mix of storage and wind and PV, no surprise. But that operating point actually is with a very, very high degree of curtailment, a 50% curtailment design. So we're not used to thinking of a world in which half of the generated energy in the power grid is thrown away, right? That's a new paradigm, right? That's not at all where we are, right? So I think you have to question this notion that somehow we must carefully husband and curate every gigawatt hour that's generated, right? Maybe the future holds a grid in which we waste more than half of the power we generate, and this is the natural product of super low cost DER generation, right? This is a natural consequence, right? So just, if you haven't seen this, again, it's not a very deep study, but it captures the macro sort of economic trending, right? And I think this kind of macroeconomic trending has to shape what our future looks like, right? You can't fight the economics at some level, right?
Thank you for the answers and comments.
Terrific.
Very good. Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. I think we should wrap up. So thank you for a great presentation and good questions from the audience as well. So I think with that, we'll close our N-Optimal seminar series. So I'd like to thank Stefanos and Vladimir as well for running the show this spring. So
thank you, Andrew, for the presentation.
And yeah,
thanks, guys.
Thank you. Excellent. And stay safe, and hopefully we'll all approach a more normal operating mode in the fall semester.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.